Hello and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to this exciting and very timely episode of Carbon Experts Live. This is our series of discussions with thought leaders across the industry to get their views on current topics and trends. I'm Laura and I'm part of the Sustainability Communications team here at One Click LCA. I'm really excited to host today's discussion. We've had an incredible amount of interest in this topic, so I'm keen to get going and introduce our speakers to you. I'm joined today by two biodiversity experts who are looking forward to digging into the topic with you all. We have James Thornton, our Biodiversity Product Specialist here at One Click LCA, and we're joined by Emily Cole, a PhD student at Southampton University, biodiversity enthusiast and ex-DEFRA Biodiversity Net Gain policy advisor. And just a quick nod to our production team as well, April and Asha. You can't see them, but they are there behind the scenes, ensuring that everything runs smoothly today. And they'll also be moderating today's live Q&A session, which takes place later on in the hour. So our topic today is preserving and promoting nature in construction. How can developers prepare for biodiversity net gain? So what can you expect from today? We're going to dive straight into the topic and why it's so important right now. Then James and Emily will be discussing biodiversity's impact on the industry, then what biodiversity net gain is, its challenges, and what the future with biodiversity net gain looks like. And then we'll close with a live Q&A where James and Emily will answer all of your questions. So don't forget to submit them into the chat, and that can be done at any point during the discussion. So without further ado, James, over to you.
Great, thanks, Laura. As Laura said, I'm James, Biodiversity Product Specialist at One Click LCA. A brief background about me is I started my career at Mott MacDonald, working as an ecologist, primarily in infrastructure and energy construction projects, and then recently completed a master's degree in computing, which has led me here to One Click. Really excited to be joined by Emily. Emily is a PhD student at University of Southampton, and she's looking at the compatibility of climate change and biodiversity targets. Emily was also an ecologist and environmental consultant at Mott MacDonald, and then moved on to be a policy advisor for Biodiversity Net Gain with DEFRA. Thanks for joining us, Emily. And first question to you is if you could just give a brief background about your story and like your journey into how you got into sustainability and biodiversity.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I've always been interested in nature since growing up. So that led me to a zoology degree. Then after that, I thought I'd focus a little bit more on biodiversity and conservation specifically. So I went and did my master's at Southampton. And then straight after that, I went to Mott MacDonald and I was an ecologist. I was an environmental consultant. I switched between doing no net loss, biodiversity net gain, and also environmental impact assessments before just focusing completely on biodiversity net gain. And I thought, let's find out everything there is to know about this. So I joined DEFRA and I was in the biodiversity net gain team for 2 years, joining basically at a time when the Environment Act had just been put in place. So we were getting all the regulations ready. So it was a really exciting time. And then I thought, let's come back to academia and let's do my PhD, but bringing all of that kind of interest together. So focusing on climate change and biodiversity. That's how I'm here.
Awesome, thanks. Let's just dive straight into it. I think it would be useful to start with is just define biodiversity as a concept and kind of set the scene. Well, we've also got biodiversity net gain. There are lots of other policies and frameworks springing up right now that it's making it a very hot topic. Could you define biodiversity for us in layman's terms?
Yeah, so biodiversity is basically, I consider it all living things. So it could be plants and animals, everything that's kind of in a simple term our natural world, but it doesn't need to be everything that's kind of hidden away in these kind of big habitats that you kind of see on TV. It's kind of all around us. And that's the bit that I'm really interested in. So specifically, so biodiversity in cities and everything like that, because it's everywhere. You just kind of have to look for it. So that is sort of biodiversity to me, and all the benefits that come with it. So whether it's just I can enjoy it on a walk, or it's food, or it's helping air quality, things like that. There's so many benefits that we get from it that you can't really see. So it's quite a difficult thing to value, which I guess is where Biodiversity Net Gain comes into it. So we are just looking at the habitats specifically when we're looking at Biodiversity Net Gain and measuring that.
Yeah, it's quite an all-encompassing term, I guess. It's the things that you see, as you say, but then the things you don't see, all the processes and the things that join this big web together. And like you said, really hard to actually quantify and measure with one single metric. Right now, I imagine most people who have joined this call are becoming acutely aware of biodiversity. It's kind of everywhere right now. There's, as we're here, Biodiversity Net Gain. There's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the EU, and then we've got these voluntary frameworks cropping up, like Taskforce on nature-related financial disclosures, TNFD, science-based targets for nature. So yeah, it's there's a lot of awareness right now, and people are kind of getting to grips with biodiversity, but there's still a lot that's unknown. But as we hear about Biodiversity Net Gain, should we just dive straight into that? Because I would consider it quite a front runner in terms of how effective it is, especially now that it's becoming policy in England. So yeah, could you just give us a little overview of Biodiversity Net Gain as a concept, what it represents and what the goals are of the concept?
Yeah, so it kind of stems from a very traditional view of, if you are developing and you are impacting habitat, the bare minimum that you had to do was at least put back what you had lost. So in terms of no net loss, just an equal playing field. You haven't lost anything, you haven't gained anything. The recognition now is that development is quite a leading cause of habitat loss and damage. So it's the policy itself is to recognize that, and recognize that we need to start putting back in a little bit more than just what we've lost. Because in terms of habitats and how long they've been established for, that value that they're giving the environment has been there for so long that if you just put back the exact same thing, it's going to take a lot of time to get back to that level. So if you put back in a little bit more, it's sort of like that safety net that you haven't ended up completely losing all of that value that was there before. So Biodiversity Net Gain is simply, you need to put back more value than was there before. The policy in England is 10% more, but in terms of measuring that, biodiversity is very difficult to value. So by using just habitats as a proxy, you can do a habitat survey, find out what is there. You can put it into a tool and it will tell you what this is valued at, and then it can predict by what you're going to put back into the site when you're done developing, how much biodiversity value you'll have at the end of it. So it's quite a good comparison tool to see what you have before and after, and it's quite a useful tool to use with your design team to kind of see the value of biodiversity after your development.
Yeah, and I think the word you used that's quite key is value. Like it's important to remember when we're talking about Biodiversity Net Gain that it's like we're talking about relative value, and that we're not measuring like absolute values or absolute metrics. Do you think it's fair to say that Biodiversity Net Gain is kind of like a framework for like promoting good actions more than like an absolute measurement of biodiversity?
Yeah. So I think it's definitely not, if you just had this number, that is the number that you can use for everything, if that makes sense. It's like a good guiding value. So like I said before, biodiversity and the benefits that it gives us are quite hard to see unless you're walking around and you can kind of feel that benefit. So having something that at least just puts you in the right direction of, this habitat here is valuable, this habitat that may not look as beneficial is also valuable. So the key thing about Biodiversity Net Gain is traditionally habitats that were maybe protected under law would be the only ones that would be protected or have some kind of weight behind them. With Biodiversity Net Gain, every single habitat on that site is given this proxy value, which I think is a really positive step forward, because even if, like I said, if you think it doesn't look very valuable, it is now being given a sort of level playing field on this type of habitat. So that's like, I think, one of my favorite things about it. Everything is valued. But like I said, that value is not the like defining part of that. There's all the other things as well. So how those habitats work with the species on the site and how the habitats kind of work with the surrounding area. It's, like I said, a guiding principle. So you can see before you even develop, maybe we should avoid this site because it's so valuable. Maybe we should go to this other site because it's slightly less valuable. It's trying to help those really early decisions before you've even started developing and have to think about mitigation. Like, how can we avoid that in the first place? So I think that's the good thing about it.
Yeah, I think what you said as well about the giving every single thing a value is really good, because lots of development is targeted to like urban areas, brownfield sites, which to many people who are not familiar with biodiversity kind of look like an easy solution. Like, there's no biodiversity there, it's all concrete, etc. But in the Biodiversity Net Gain framework now, those sites are recognized, that not always, but they can have a lot of value for biodiversity, and they're quite complex habitats, especially when they've been left for a long period of time.
Yeah, definitely. I think I've always seen, examples where you may not think a small scrubby habitat is the most biodiverse habitat. Most people tend to think of woodlands in this country as like being the best, like wetlands and things like that. But just having something that says this scrub is really important, it's supporting this really rare species, so we need to put back in more of this and not get rid of it. So the development afterwards has lots of this habitat and even more. So it ends up being more beneficial because you've taken that into consideration and not just kind of written it off as this not very nice looking habitat sometimes, but it is serving a purpose. So you should keep that and do a lot more of it afterwards as well. So a good part for nature recovery as well, if you can keep those habitats and add a little bit more to them afterwards, that's like the ultimate goal.
And then quite a key discussion that goes around at the moment related to nature recovery is this on-site versus off-site gain or compensation. I suppose there's arguments for both directions, but yeah, if you could give your thoughts about whether on-site versus off-site should be prioritized. What do you feel about that?
Yeah, I've always got a lot to say about this. In terms of on-site, for me, because this is a tool that is aimed at development, so it's not, so that's like its main purpose, rather than just how can we get biodiversity into kind of everything. It's purely, let's start with the development first and address that impact. So if you were developing on a site, I think if you're losing biodiversity from that site, the priority would be to put back in the biodiversity that was on that site and a bit more. Because I've always linked it with, if there were existing communities that were enjoying that biodiversity, they had those benefits, they shouldn't be the ones to lose those benefits to a site further away. So my priority would always be try and get it on site as much as you can. Ideally pick a site where you're not losing too much biodiversity in the first place. So don't develop in a woodland, for example, in a simple situation. In terms of the offsite, there are obviously arguments that in some small urban locations, putting back in biodiversity is more difficult. So if you could put a lot more offsite in a larger, more strategic location, surely that's beneficial for biodiversity. And in some cases, yes, it is. But like I said, because it's development, and if we're like shifting biodiversity that was serving a purpose somewhere to elsewhere, I think that can be quite complicated as well. And I think, like I said, yeah, keeping it in that place where those benefits were in the first place, and not just shifting it. It always links to sort of access to nature as well. I can kind of link all the well-being things and that kind of aspect as well. But yeah, it's a decision to weigh up. But the policy here is priority is on site. If you can't do it on site, you can top up offsite, and that's where you can start looking for those good strategic locations. But I don't think the first decision should be, let's just put it all offsite and do it there. I think that gets a bit complicated as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's quite a good point that highlights why biodiversity is such a big topic right now, is because even though this policy is focused on biodiversity, there's all these connected unseen benefits that we all get from biodiversity, not even thinking about the species themselves. So prioritizing biodiversity net gain in these at the development site, especially in these urban environments, yeah, whole host of benefits, social benefits, well-being, climate change, resilience, etc. So while I don't think that's kind of embedded into the policy of the framework, I assume that it was kind of thought about when prioritizing on-site development was the guiding principle.
Yeah, I think in terms of the policy itself, it's biodiversity net gain with an intention of at some point going to environmental net gain. So incorporating all of those other aspects and how it links to air quality, carbon storage, all of that. That's like the long-term goal. But starting with biodiversity was sort of seen as, if we can do this, we can tag in everything else. So hopefully in the long term, it will be more of a, how does this contribute to tackling climate change and things like that, which I think is the ultimate long-term goal, is linking everything together, because there's obviously more recognition now that biodiversity isn't just the other crisis to look at. It's equally as weighted as the climate crisis, and you can't solve one without the other. So yeah, hopefully it becomes a bit more of an incorporated tool in the future.
Yeah. So yeah, I feel like we've got a good understanding of biodiversity net gain right now. It would be good to talk about what this mandatory biodiversity net gain actually means, kind of who's affected, who should be thinking about it now. So could you give us a little introduction into the mandatory biodiversity net gain and how we kind of got here?
Yep. So it was decided that net gain would become mandatory back in 2019. So from there, there's been various consultations about how it will work, what the policy would look like, what people need to do. And that has been happening since, I guess, when I joined end of 2021, and just kind of getting everything ready for 2024. So once the Environment Act came in 2021, we had a few years to get everything ready. And this is where we are now. So on the 12th of February, it will become mandatory. And what that means is if you are a new planning application under the Town and Country Planning Act in this country, which is sort of the primary planning law, if you're not a major sort of nationally significant infrastructure project, most planning will come under Town and Country Planning. So there's a few exemptions, like for particularly like really, really small patches of impact. And there's a couple of other exemptions as well, but most new development will come under this rule. So essentially what that means in terms of getting prepared is, ideally, you would think about net gain a lot earlier in the development process. So traditionally it would kind of be, when it wasn't mandatory, it was sort of voluntary. People will kind of look at it as, oh, we need to now do biodiversity net gain. It's not really something you can do far on in the planning or design process, because once you've chosen a site, once you've done all of the design, it can be very difficult to then look at the value and say, I now need to magic up 10%. The point of doing it and having it so early on in terms of consideration is that, a little bit like I said before, you can use the calculation metric tool as a kind of decision making tool for different sites. So you can say, this one's really valuable, this one's less valuable, maybe we go for the less valuable one. It's trying to like get those conversations in really early on. And that's, I guess, how you can be the most prepared. So I think in terms of the rule coming in, there's lots of guidance out now on the government website. There's all the legislation is there as well, but the guidance kind of breaks it down into more understandable language. So I would just assume that if you're doing a new application, to be aware of it, and just kind of know what you need to do in terms of submitting alongside your planning application. So you'd have to have your calculation tool saying how valuable your site was at the beginning, how valuable you think the site will be at the end, and that kind of goes in as part of your planning application as well.
Yeah, that definitely highlighted one of the key barriers to being prepared for this. Is I'm sure you'll agree with your background that it's kind of been like a bit of a box ticking exercise before, at least historically. It's often like yeah, as you said, very late in the design process, and then it creates this kind of us against them. Like biodiversity is seen as a like barrier to construction, whereas what this is trying to do is, as you said, get it really early in the design phase, so that it's working with design team, with developers to promote good actions. And I guess like that's the main thing that needs to change really, is like a cultural shift. Something that I know Julia Baker, who's been heavily involved with Biodiversity Net Gain, talks about is like team biodiversity, or team Biodiversity Net Gain, which I really like. I'm a big fan of that phrase. And it's kind of putting responsibility on everyone involved in the design. They need to be aware of it, and there needs to be kind of like buy-in from people.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I would, always echo what Julia says. I think, the cultural shift in terms of it can't just be the ecologist versus the design team. It's meant to be a way of how can you design a development that works for biodiversity, rather than we've designed something, we've now removed all this biodiversity, and now it's kind of seen as a burden to put it back in, or it will slow things down. It definitely doesn't need to be like that. It needs to be, let's design it from the outset with biodiversity in mind. And it's so much easier when you look at it that way. If you leave it to the end, it's going to be incredibly complicated. And the pressure on ecologists to kind of magic up these miracles for you is very difficult. I've been in that situation. I'd really prefer it if ecologists were kind of brought in from the beginning so they can help design. And the useful thing I've always seen is with the tool itself, although valuing biodiversity in this kind of proxy measure has its limitations, fully accept that, but having something that just demonstrates to someone who isn't from an ecological background how a certain habitat is contributing to that area is so useful in design making decisions. So you can get an engineer, you can get someone who is not familiar with these habitats on board from the beginning, because you can say, here are the habitats we have, this is their relative value on this site. Now, if you put in concrete or a building, you've now lost X amount of this value. And that is so much easier to demonstrate rather than sort of saying, please don't harm this habitat. You have something to go in with and kind of justify your decisions. So that for me has always been, that's how I've got people on side and got that buy-in, like you said. So I think it's a really important tool that way, just to think of biodiversity as something that we can all work with rather than working against it.
Yeah, I think the habitat thing is really, really good, because it's, like you said, it's very tangible. Like, assuming you go at the right time of year, you can get your design team onto site and they can see and engage with these habitats that are on site, so they have a direct connection with the biodiversity. Whereas trying to communicate to a design team about like a small population of a certain species on site that they will never ever see, it's really hard to communicate that. But I think getting people on site as early as possible, and everyone just engaging with it is really, really key.
Yeah, having those conversations as early as possible, and seeing it, not just maps, sort of do the maps, take people out to see it, is always a win in my eyes.
Yeah, and I think something that we did touch on as well is like how the goal for this overarching like environmental net gain is going to be a big thing, because some two words that people will probably start seeing a lot more if they don't already is like impacts and dependencies. People need to start realizing, if they don't already, that you have impacts on biodiversity, but you also have dependency. So you could, as an example, like retaining some habitat on site or creating a new habitat for like sustainable urban drainage could be a lot cheaper and a lot more beneficial to biodiversity than creating something out of concrete to handle your drainage, etc.
Yeah, I think if we can get to a stage where we can demonstrate all of those benefits together in an easy tool that is easily understandable by non-experts as well, I think that's the key thing. If you can get people who haven't got an ecology and environment background on board with something that kind of demonstrates, like you said, if you put in more sort of natural habitat, natural solutions, like nature-based solutions, that will always be cheaper in the long run. Just like further down the line, I'm always going to be like, we don't need any more concrete. Let's just try and get in nature where we can. So yeah, having something that demonstrates all of that is going to be so helpful, because yeah, with the impacts and dependencies, everything you do is going to have an impact on something else. So I think understanding how it all links together will be complicated to do in a tool, but hopefully there'll be something that we can learn from this and we can bring it all together in a simple format.
Yeah, definitely. So I think we're kind of leaning in towards what we would like to see for the future, so we could continue down that road for now. How do you see biodiversity net gain? Like, do you see it becoming this thing, environmental net gain, as one tool, or do you see kind of interconnected, like different policies and different frameworks that sit neatly together? So we always have biodiversity net gain, and then you have these indirect impacts assessed in a different way.
I think for now, because it is such a major change in planning, and that's how, that's how this is being pushed forward, is through planning. So I think for now, it will be good to stay as biodiversity net gain, get people on side, get people to understand it. Because from where I am, you can kind of assume lots of people know what it is, but there's still lots of people who have never had to do biodiversity net gain before, who are less familiar with it. So once we get more people on side and more familiar with it, I think then we can learn from the policy itself. That's normally what happens with new policy is things will happen. It won't be smooth sailing from the beginning, but that's how we learn from it. And through monitoring it, we can tweak things. And I think that's what will happen for the next couple of years. It will be a big learning curve for a lot of people, and that's fine. That's how a lot of the current policies we have now have come into place. It takes a little bit of time to get used to it. And then from there, I think we can build on it and go into keeping it all together. But I think for now, it will be biodiversity net gain is a new thing for planning. People can start to understand the links with the other policies. As well, if you're achieving biodiversity net gain, you're naturally ticking up a lot of the other policies that a local authority will want to see in terms of like nature-based solutions, sustainable urban drainage, things like that. So it already ticks a lot of the boxes without even thinking about it. So I think maybe hopefully something will bring that all together, so somebody doesn't need to kind of see how it all links magically. It will just do that. Yeah. But I think for now it will just be the let's get it going and kind of learn from it, and then see where we can tweak it.
Yeah, that's also one of the great things about this habitats focus is like we don't really need to be focusing on absolute metrics right now. Like the benefits come with the positive actions, even if you don't necessarily see and measure it all. Like if you do these positive actions and you create habitats and enhance habitats, like good things will happen. So yeah, that's the key thing right now. And I guess one final question about this is, you're probably a little bit biased, but do you see biodiversity net gain being adopted in other countries, or like do you see it as, is that something you want to see? Do you think it's going to go that way?
Yeah, I do, and I hope it does. So I used to have lots of conversations. I used to focus primarily on the metric tool itself, and we would have conversations with other countries who were really keen to adopt it in their country. They just kind of saw it as, this is a really simple tool. It's better than what they had, in that kind of, like I said, moving away from that traditional, we'll just clear a habitat and maybe we'll put back in a couple of trees. It needs to be putting back in what you've lost or better. And that was something that they were really keen on doing, obviously just adapting it for the habitats in their specific country. And having those conversations was just really motivating and inspiring to see that it was being picked up already. And hopefully we can all learn from each other in terms of how this country has adopted it and how another country has adopted it. So yeah, I think it's a really exciting space to be in, with this really transformative policy that kind of everyone seems to be mostly getting on board with, and kind of understanding that we need to start doing a little bit more for biodiversity and not just clearing and putting back in kind of less habitat than we've been taking away, because yeah, we need to start moving towards nature recovery now and preventing biodiversity loss. So it's really positive to see that others have started to pick it up as well.
Yeah, and I suppose a question to follow up with that is that for maybe those people who aren't ecologists, they might assume that they could just pick up the tool and use it in their country. But I suppose it's worth highlighting like the background work that's gone into it, how it makes it specific to England.
Yeah, so the habitats that are used in our tool is based on UK habitat classification. It used to be based on phase 1 habitats, which was another classification tool used here. It got updated in one of the previous versions. It's a slightly easier kind of all-encompassing classification. So yeah, it would be, if you were to pick it up in another country, that's the first thing you need to look at, the habitats. And in terms of the initial value that habitats are given, it's called distinctiveness. So it's based on how rare they are, how easy this habitat is to recreate. So a habitat in our country may be particularly rare, but in another country it may be very common. So the value there would need to be adjusted. So that's why it's something to look at, because you could be overvaluing it or undervaluing it if you were to pick it up and run with it in a different country. So that's the first thing we always said to people: look at that, look at the rarity, is it protected, all that kind of information, and then you could start adjusting it for your country.
Yeah, I think it's actually a lot bigger than maybe people realize. The differences, like for clarity, like Biodiversity Net Gain is about to be enforced in England, but is not in Scotland. To maybe the layperson, the environments in Scotland and England seem pretty similar. You would assume like the biodiversity is basically the same, but one example could be like heathland in England receiving quite a high score because it's relatively rare, whereas in Scotland, a bit more abundant and wouldn't really be valued in the same way. So it needs adapting even to countries that seem really, really similar.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's also a point for the future, is in terms of how rare a habitat is. It would be, so when the metric is working as it is, there's going to be review periods to kind of assess the rarity and how these habitats are currently performing, because especially in terms of climate change, like temperatures will change, habitats will change. We can't keep using values from the past if we're going to look at this in the future. So that's another long-term goal, is to keep reviewing it in line with, how rare the habitats are, how easy they are to recreate. And that's the same for any country. Like, it could all kind of shift. So being resilient to those changes as well is something that needs to be incorporated moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. But I think now that the methodology is pretty established, like it shouldn't be, I'm not going to say it's going to be easy, but it shouldn't be too hard to keep it updated or for countries to adapt it. Like, you've got this methodology, you've got a tool, you really just need to focus on getting those habitats that are relevant to you, and you could start using it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we'll wrap up this section. That was super helpful. I think we covered a lot of ground.
That's good.
Yeah. So yeah, if we could just go to the next slide, please, April. I'll give a really brief introduction into what One Click LCA is doing in the topic of biodiversity. So yeah, we're obviously very well established now in the LCA field, looking at carbon and other emissions. And because of everything we've been talking about, we think it's really important to start providing support for people to look at measuring and reporting on their biodiversity impacts, as well as their positive actions. So we'll be releasing a tool shortly to support Biodiversity Net Gain. The goal of that tool is to simplify this early design screening process that Emily touched upon. The tool is maybe intimidating to people who are not familiar with it. There's a lot of information, and we want people who are on One Click LCA who are really early in the design phase, comparing some options to be able to get an idea of their biodiversity net gain early on and start comparing sites. So we're going to be helping people who are not so familiar with biodiversity net gain do that. We've partnered with UK HAB, who, as Emily said, are the providers of the habitat classification system. So it fully complies with the statutory biodiversity net gain framework and all the methodology. So all of your calculations will be the same. That should be coming out shortly. It's targeted for Q1. But we've also just released our first biodiversity tool, which is shown on the screen here. This is assessing the impacts that we've discussed that aren't captured by Biodiversity Net Gain. Biodiversity Net Gain is really fantastic for the direct site impacts and getting positive outcomes there, but there are these whole indirect impacts that occur, especially with the supply chain and construction. It's a massive driver of biodiversity loss, particularly land use change and climate change. So we've got this tool that's available now that provides an estimate of the global biodiversity impact from your supply chain. So you can do a new assessment, or you can use your existing LCA data, and at the end of it, you get an idea of hotspots in your supply chain, so particular materials that are potentially really impactful, and the results are presented as a single unit, like a single number, so it becomes really intuitive to then compare across either individual products. You can compare them directly, or you can compare your designs and start making changes. It also reflects positive impacts in the sense of recycling or reusing materials is positively reflected in this by reducing your score, your biodiversity impact. And the graph on the screen is just an example of one of the outputs. For those who are familiar with One Click LCA, you'll be familiar with this graph, but this is categorizing the materials by type, and then showing you a nice graph of which ones are the biggest contributors. The tool contains a lot of impact categories, but they're broadly under the categories of climate change, pollution, and resource use. Resource use in this case being primarily water use. Land use is not captured through this tool, as we have the Biodiversity Net Gain module coming soon. I think that's a good summary of the tools. I believe we have a lot of questions, so we can move on to that if that works.
Yeah, thank you, James, and thank you, Emily. That was a really captivating 25 minutes, so thank you for that. I'm just going to jump in quickly to give our audience the chance to let us know if you're interested in finding out more about One Click LCA's biodiversity tools that James was just talking about there, or any of the other solutions that One Click provides. So if you're joining us in Livestorm, you should see the question appear on your screen now, so you can go ahead and let us know there. If you're joining from LinkedIn, do drop a comment in the chat and we'll capture that and make sure that we get in touch shortly. But yes, we do have a lot of questions to get through, so let's move on to that section. We'll hand over to the audience. We'll get some questions up on the screen. Please drop them into the questions box if you haven't already. So that's the questions box in Livestorm or the LinkedIn chat if you're joining us there. So, okay, our first question to you both then is, 10% biodiversity net gain focuses on direct operations, excluding value chain impacts. Besides land use, how are other biodiversity loss drivers like pollution or water stress addressed?
Do you want to go, Emily, or shall I?
I was just going to start. So primarily, it's just looking at whether the habitat has been lost or whether you're keeping habitats on site and you're enhancing them. So it's mainly to do with that. And obviously other things around biodiversity net gain, like whether there's pollution or water stress surrounding, that can be incorporated into the planning application, but it wouldn't go into the biodiversity net gain calculation specifically. It's very much on direct habitat loss. If there's anything else you want to add, James, but I think that's...
No, I think that was, very clear. I think the point is that these things should be looked at, like you said, within the planning application, but they're captured through different assessments, and it's not quite at the point where we can capture all of those in biodiversity net gain.
Yeah, like the key thing as well about the policy is there's existing regulations and environmental legislation in place. Those things that cover things like pollution and water are still considered. Biodiversity net gain is in addition to all of those existing environmental legislation and regulations that you have to consider in planning. This is something else to consider. So it's not replacing anything. It's something else to do.
Good, thank you. Okay, next question for you both. Is there research on plants most affected by rapid climate change? And instead of like-for-like replacement, are there studies on selecting more resilient species for anticipated new climates?
I'm not aware of studies, but I know, particularly in urban environments, ecologists are starting to recommend more climate resilient species, especially where it's in a case where you're not really having to directly replace lost like native biodiversity. If you have the opportunity to go above and beyond and plant new species, that's really good for climate resilient species, particularly on things like green roofs. And Natural England have been researching about carbon storage potential of different habitats. So as Emily touched upon before, like we think that's probably going to be something that will happen in the future, where you have this more integrated assessment that has biodiversity net gain, that values it for biodiversity and things like carbon sequestration and climate resilience. But at the moment, it's kind of on a development by development case.
Thank you very much. Okay, so next up, can you elaborate on the complexities of off-site biodiversity relocation? What are the challenges and how can developers optimize its benefits?
I can start with kind of what it means for the calculation. So when you are assessing the value of your development site, that's your overall baseline. That's what you need to get 10% higher on. If you were to do your post-development calculation and it's all within the same site, there's no sort of value that can be kind of taken down from that. When you're calculating habitats in the post-development stage, you have to consider things like how long it takes to create, how difficult it is to create. That's standard for all post-development creation. The additional factor or complexity when you're looking at the off-site location is that dependent on how far away that location is from your development site, there will be an additional multiplier, so additional part of the calculation that's taken into consideration. So ideally, you want your off-site location, which is basically anywhere outside of your development boundary, to be as close as possible to your original site. The further away it goes, the less value you could get for your new biodiversity created. So that's why the sort of the complexities of, if I was to go really far off site and this is a really large, strategic, well-connected location, I'm still getting slightly less because it's all compared to how far away that is from your development. You can still do really good things. And I think based on consultations, we did reduce how harshly penalized you were for going further away, because there are biodiversity benefits to a certain location. But ideally, it's, yeah, as close as you can be to your original site. That's how you could get the most kind of value recorded in the tool.
Anything to add there, James, or should we take the next question?
No, that was great.
Okay.
Let's move on to the next one.
Perfect. So next up, how do you quantify and express the economic benefits in feasibility studies for projects like wastewater treatment or industrial tech upgrades, given their indirect impact on biodiversity?
Well, that's a tough question.
I think so the current tool at the moment doesn't specifically include the economic benefits. In the development of this tool, there have been previous sort of like counties within England who have picked this up and gone with it, and they've had previously made their own tool. One county, for example, so Warwickshire, they had a tool where it would demonstrate the economic benefits of keeping a habitat, of how much it would cost to lose that habitat. That's something that wasn't taken forward into this part of the tool, that's the standardized tool that everyone now needs to use. So everyone needs to use the same one that's been produced by the government. But I think moving forward, there's nothing to say that they couldn't bring that back in, or that maybe it's another tool on the side that you could use to kind of calculate the economic benefits of it. It's something that Biodiversity Net Gain wouldn't do on its own. So maybe that's a tool in the future that they bring back in as another way of kind of demonstrating those benefits. At the moment, it's purely just done on biodiversity value. Yeah.
Great. James, anything? Should we move on? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so does the Environment Act and its tools also cover marine developments and the marine environment? James, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, I think Emily will probably know more about it, but I am aware that a marine biodiversity net gain is like being studied. I don't know if it's actually developed right now or if it's like a feasibility study as to it.
Yeah, I can
Sure.
kind of fill you in. So essentially, in the stage that Biodiversity Net Gain was in 2019, when they did a consultation on whether it would be mandatory, that is the stage that Marine Net Gain, or MNG, is in at the moment. So they did a consultation last year on whether that should be mandatory. I think they're still in the process of submitting the response to that and saying where the government want to go with that. But it will be hopefully an additional tool alongside Biodiversity Net Gain. So the complexities of where that kind of crossover, there's lots of stuff in the Biodiversity Net Gain guidance that says where Biodiversity Net Gain ends and where Marine Net Gain would begin, because it's all about that intertidal crossover and when it suddenly becomes marine. So those complexities are still sort of being worked through, but ideally there would be Biodiversity Net Gain happening and MNG happening at the same time. But like I said, it's a couple of years behind the stage that Biodiversity Net Gain is in. So I can't say when it will happen, but that's the ultimate goal, is that it will work alongside BNG.
Great, thank you.
Yeah,
So
and also just quick to add that in BNG right now, there are like coastal and intertidal habitats. So depending on your development, that could be something that you could use already, but yeah.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, are there specific biodiversity net gain value requirements to meet or comply with the policy?
I think the main one is the aim of it being 10% value that you need to be at or beyond. And how you get there is within the tool. We've been saying a lot of when you're losing a habitat to put back that habitat. The way that the tool is set up is that different habitats have got those slightly different distinctiveness levels that I previously mentioned. So certain habitats of certain values have slightly different rules. If they're less valuable, easy to replicate, you could put back in whatever habitat you'd like, if it's better. The really, really valuable habitats, so the woodlands, you need to put back those habitats. You can't put back any lower. It's probably difficult to go above and beyond those habitats because they are so valuable. So that's just something to be aware of. You can't just have a site that's mixed of sort of grass and woodland pond and then put back in super valuable woodland, because those other habitats need to be considered. So it's about maintaining the site how it was and just going a little bit better, not completely changing the site for a numbers situation. So you have to kind of follow those rules of what type of habitat you can put back in. But from there, you can be quite flexible with what you do.
Great, thank you. I think we've got a handful of questions left, so we'll get to those. And anyone who doesn't have their question answered, we will be distributing the questions and answers afterwards, so don't worry. Are there established working groups of engineers and ecologists focused on defining each other's requirements and identifying key opportunities?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any. It sounds like a great idea. I think, yeah, I think it happens on a project by project basis within the development, but yeah, a working group certainly sounds like a good idea to me. I think it's, yeah, on the project basis, it just needs buy-in from people like we discussed, and architects and landscape architects working very closely with ecologists and environmental professionals, because lots of the work that a landscape architect is doing is going to be actually really similar to Biodiversity Net Gain. It's just not using the same language right now. So those two people need to be working really close together.
How does ongoing maintenance factor in? Are maintenance routines automatically included in habitat plans under the Biodiversity Net Gain mandate?
Yeah, so when you put in your new habitats, they need to be in place for at least 30 years. So the calculation tool, when it calculates the value, will kind of consider time it takes to create, how difficult it is to create, and all of those kind of conditions that you need to meet to get that habitat to a certain level can be incorporated into your habitat management and monitoring plan. So that'll kind of keep track of it all. So it is sort of included. And yeah, it's just on the onus to kind of keep those for 30 years and go from there.
Great, thank you. And I believe we're going to finish the Q&A section with this question here. So for both of you, are there established working groups? Oh, I feel like we've had this question. Okay, so maybe we're going to wrap up there unless there's any other questions, April? Nope. Okay, good stuff. So I think if we can just move back to the slides, there's just a couple of things from me as we wrap up the session. So we're nearing the end. Thank you to everyone who's joined us and for all of those questions as well. If you're keen to find out more about Biodiversity Net Gain and how One Click LCA is supporting the industry, you can scan the QR code on screen there, which will take you through to a recent article we published, so you can find out more. We'll be adding this session recording to that page as well. And also, as I mentioned, the questions and answers from the session. So if you didn't have a question answered or you think of one after the session, that's fine. Let us know, and then we'll make sure that's included on there. And then next slide, please, April. Perfect, thank you. We also have a huge collection of other resources all about decarbonising manufacturing and construction. So please do check those out as well. These QR codes will take you straight to our website. And the final couple of things from me as we wrap up, feel free to connect with our speakers on LinkedIn or via email. They're more than happy to continue this conversation with you. And if you'd like to get in touch with One Click LCA, you can see our contact details there on the right-hand side of the screen. Next slide, please, April. Thank you. And finally, if you enjoyed today's session, I do highly encourage you to keep an eye out for the upcoming episodes of Carbon Experts Live. Our next episode takes place on the 5th of February. We'll be chatting to David McLean, who is the founder and president of McMac CX, all about how architects can maximise financial returns whilst meeting aspirational environmental and social impact goals. So you can find all the details about that and how to register on our website. Thank you again to everyone who attended today. Thank you again to Emily and James for that really enlightening topic coverage, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you.